Okay, hi everyone. So moving on, let's talk about observational measures. Um, so when it comes to research, we talked a bit last week, depending on when you're watching this, we talked a bit about survey measures. And survey measures are of course great when it comes to measuring something that people can probably accurately report. So if you ask them, what is your opinion on this particular issue? What is your opinion on, I don't know, recycling? I mean, chances are they're probably gonna what they report is probably gonna be pretty close to what they think, right? We all have cognitive and social biases, but generally some issues, or maybe plenty of issues, just asking people um, is pretty straightforward and gets the job done. However, there might be situations where we want to actually watch them behave and quantify that instead of asking them. So, to give you an example, if I was looking at something to do with aggression, well, aggression is not really something that is so great to ask about. I mean, you can ask people, okay, last time you were aggressive, what made you aggressive? What made you violent? Well, I mean, will they even remember? Will they even be accurate? Will what they think made them aggressive or violent actually be what made them aggressive? Possibly, very possibly not, right? So in situations like that, we might want to actually, instead of using some sort of survey measure, use an observational measure. We might want to um, just see them behave and actually code their behavior in terms of uh, what they do. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about observational measures and how you measure this because it's not quite as straightforward as some other metrics that you might use. So an observational measure, not to be confused with naturalistic observation, because that's actually a different thing. So when we're talking about naturalistic observation, we're just talking about watching people do something in their in a realistic, no, not even a realistic, but their actual environment. If I wanted to just sit on a bench and watch how many people throw their trash in the garbage versus how many people throw it on the floor or the ground, um, that would be naturalistic observation. But you can, of course, have structured observation too. You can run experiments using structured observation. So if you think back a long time ago, we talked about, or you saw that example of the attachment styles study. So they had children playing, and then their mothers came and went from the room. Um, that would be a structured observation because it is actually an experiment, but you're still observing behavior as opposed to, having them give their response to a survey or to a memory test or whatever it might be. So yeah, you can have basically all the designs we've talked about. You can have just pure observational or descriptive research where you're just counting and you're not dividing it into conditions. You can have correlational observations. You can have structured observations and experimental observations. Um, but you can have all those. But what we're going to talk about today is just how exactly observation works. Because, like I said, um, coding the data, scoring the data can be trickier than some other ways of collecting data. Right? And yeah, if you just want to take notes on that. So remember, naturalistic observations, just watching them in their natural behavior, structured observation. You're going to have an experiment or manipulated event or a situation. This can occur in the lab or the field. But again, the distinction is just that with any kind of observation, you're obviously observing behavior as opposed to something else. Okay, so the main point I want to get across with this part is that, like I said, when you are just observing behavior, behavior can be a little bit subjective and it's not always 100% clear how one person is going to interpret a behavior, or not even interpret it, but record a behavior versus another. So, in the example we'll get to, we're again talking about aggression. Well, how you're going to measure, how you're going to quantify aggression is not so simple, right? I mean, is it the number of people you attack? Is it the number of people you um, say mean things to? Is it something else, some combination? It could be a lot of different things, right? So that's where we, run into complications with observational measures. So with observational measures, we have to, like we've said before, operationally define some kind of behavior. Remember that an operational definition is how you convert something you're interested in, some construct, some process, um, some thought, some line of thinking into an actual numerical measure that you're going to analyze. And then we're going to code those behaviors that you observe. Right? And by the way, a lot of this also ties in. This overlaps a lot with open-ended survey and interview responses. So remember we talked a bit last week about if you have an open-ended survey, meaning people can respond however they want, you have to come up with a coding scheme. You can't just, interpret things the way you want, pick and choose examples and say, well, this is what the responses show. You have to actually think of a way that you're going to translate that into, an objective coding scheme and actual numerical measure. So anyways, so a lot of what we're going to talk about here, or I'd say almost all of it, also goes hand in hand with analyzing open-ended surveys, because the same way that you might be operationally defining a behavior that you're just observing, you might operationally define response of some type. Okay. Now, coding schemes consist of behaviors, like we said, and they can be very specific or they can be more general. And as always, it just depends on your research question. But there's certainly pros and cons to each. So when it comes to something like aggression, well, that's a pretty general behavior, a pretty general operational definition. And I would say not a very good operational definition because it's so open to interpretation, as we're going to see when we do a little activity. Something like more specific, like say any kind of physical attack, like hitting or kicking or punching or biting or whatever else you want to include in there, would be more specific. Now, in general, it is good to be specific. However, sometimes that's not an option. So there might be cases where you want to be specific, but you can't. If you're really interested in aggression, maybe hitting and kicking is not really what it's only a small piece of what you're really interested in. So then you might need to broaden it, even though that can complicate things. Okay. Let's ignore that slide. So there's a few different ways you can do that. You can quantify it just by the presence or the absence of behavior. You can just ask people, how many times did this person behave aggressively? You can also use a rating. So kind of like a Likert scale, only the person watching the experiment is going to do it. So they're going to rate someone from not at all aggressive to very aggressive in terms of their behavior. And then the last one you can do is duration, so how long the behavior lasts. Okay. And again, this all just depends on your research question and what might be most feasible and useful in terms of your research question at hand. Okay, but on to kind of the meat and gravy of observations and as well as interviews and open-ended surveys. for that matter, like we said. Um, you really need to be clearly define these behaviors and be very precise to avoid confusion. So again, you want to be as specific as possible. Um, you don't want to, obviously, like we said, the more kind of open-ended or subjective the behavior is, the easier it is to mess up. So if you can be the more specific you can be, the better. But at the same time, you also don't want to avoid the temptation to accomplish too much in one study. Okay. So, for example, again, with aggression, you don't want to have like 50 different behaviors um, that you're keeping track of, because that's really hard for someone who's coding the data, coding the behavior to keep track of, right? It's very hard to think of 50 different things at the same time. Okay, so it's kind of a balancing act between being very specific and precise about what you're measuring, what counts as, say, aggressive behavior, but also not overbearing the whoever's watching the study with too many different things to keep track of. Okay, so I'm not gonna show it here because they'll hit me with copyright, but this video is just posted just below this video in the module. So just click on that, and then move on to the next piece of lecture. Right.